So now the slides are visible. Sorry. So the question that I did, how does an international political event come into existence? Because it's not enough that governments decide we're going to meet or choose a date, but to create a political event is necessary to communicate, to tell it. A political event, so we can say that without communication, there is no visibility. Without visibility, there is not recognition. And without recognition, there is not a political meaning. From this perspective, political events are not only diplomatic facts, they are also media events, linguistic constructions, and cultural performance. This is why when we talk about Bandung 1955, we shouldn't think only about what happened inside conference rooms. We should also think about who was watching, who was listening, who was telling the story, and how the story traveled beyond Bandung. So this perspective is especially important for understanding the Afro-Asian Students' Conference of 1956. That conference didn't emerge simply because students decided to organize it. It emerged because Bandung 1955 was communicated, interpreted, and imagined as a turning point. So the Bandung 1955 inspired the students to organize another conference the year later. So in other words, Bandung didn't only produce diplomatic outcomes, it produced meanings, expectations, and political imagination. And this traveled through media, language, and symbols. So the Afro-Asian Conference of 1955, the Bandung Conference, was the first large international meeting that brought together 29 Asian and African countries. You can see here in the maps the 29 countries. There were 5 host countries, Indonesia, India, Pakistan, Myanmar, and Sri Lanka. Then we can see in orange the other 24 countries. And then there is one in blue. The country in blue was the Central African Federation, today Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi. And this country rejected the invitation to take part in this conference. So, from a diplomatic point of view, the participation of 29 Afro-Asian countries was really something extraordinary. But from the point of view of communication, Bandung was even more radical. For the first time, Asian and African countries became highly visible on the global media stage. The conference took place in April 1955 in a world shaped by decolonization and the Cold War. The participating countries were very, very different from one another, but they shared 2 key experiences: colonial domination from one side and political marginalization in international system. Even though they represent more than half of world population, these 29 Afro-Asian countries were largely absent from major stages of global visibility. For example, the United Nations and also international media. Bandung changed this situation not only because political leaders met there, but because the meeting was watched, recorded, and described, and also it circulated around the world. More than 566 journalists attended the conference, so they were a lot. And they came from 39 countries, so the journalists represented more countries than the delegates, because the delegates were from 29 countries, while the journalists were from 39 countries. These journalists represent 8 major international news agencies, such as Reuters, Associated Press, and also TASS from the Soviet Union. This level of media presence was unprecedented for an event taking place outside Europe and North America. The Indonesian government played a very active role in shaping this communicative dimension. There were 2 central press centers in Bandung, because these journalists were a lot. And these spaces were equipped with distributed text, photographs, and daily bulletins in multiple languages. So communication was a serious thing, and the Indonesian government organized everything to spread this conference around the world. Local Indonesian media were equally important. Newspapers such as Harian Rakyat and Indonesia Raya published special issues dedicated to the conference. In doing so, the media became accessible not only to an international audience, but also to Indonesian people. Bandung wasn't only communicating outward to the rest of the world, it was also communicated inward, inside Indonesia. At the same time, communication was not neutral. The freedom to report was limited and often contested. Some delegations tried to control how the conference was portrayed. The Indonesian government itself created a commission to manage the flow of information and to counter possible distortion. Meanwhile, many Western media outlets interpret Bandung through the lens of the Cold War, often presenting it as a potentially hostile or threatening country. In contrast, many media in Asia and Africa describe the conference as a moment of symbolic emancipation and collective self-assertion. Here we can clearly see the central role of media in political processes. In a situation like this, journalists don't simply transmit information, they do at least three things at the same time. First, they make the event visible, they describe speeches, atmospheres, and things at the same time, and formal sessions at the same time. Second, journalists interpret journalists interpret what they see using the political categories available to them at that moment. And finally, they also actively contribute to create the meaning of the event itself. So how the journalist tells something is important. How the people perceive that event. The idea of the spirit of Bandung didn't emerge only from official declaration. It emerged from articles, editorial, photographs, headlines, and public discussions that circulate for months and even years after the conference. So Bandung is still famous today, also thanks the narratives, thanks the article published at that time. In this sense, journalists weren't just witnesses. They were, we can say, indirect political actors. Bandung, therefore, wasn't limited to what happened inside conference halls. It also exists in newspapers, magazines, and conversations taking place far away from Indonesia. Because also in Europe, also in North America, everyone was talking about the Bandung Conference of 1955. This communicative visibility transformed Bandung from a diplomatic meeting into a lasting historical reference point. And this visibility allowed Bandung to travel to reach audiences that weren't present at the conference, including students. Through these channels, Bandung also reached universities, student organizations, and informal intellectual networks across Asia and Africa. For many students, Bandung wasn't simply an international summit, it was a signal. It showed that Asian and African countries could appear on the global stage as collective political actors. It demonstrated that international politics didn't have to pass only through Western institutions or Western voices. And most importantly, it showed that visibility itself could be politically transformative. For students, this visibility mattered enormously. It suggested political agency wasn't limited to governments. It suggested new actors could enter international debates if they were able to organize, communicate, and be seen. In this sense, the African Conference, or the Students' Conference of 1956, didn't emerge directly from the official document of Bandung. It emerged from the way Bandung was narrated, interpreted, and imagined. The Afro-Asian Student Conference took place in Bandung from 30 May 1956. Bandung became a foundational event not simply because of what was decided then, but because it was communicated as a turning point at something that was changing how African and Asian countries were perceived also abroad in the context of Cold War. So the context is really important and crucial to understand all this. Through media coverage, images, and public discussion, Bandung came to represent the possibility of Afro-Asian unity and autonomous political expression. This symbolic dimension was something new for all these countries. In Indonesia, this process was particularly intense. The fact that the 1955 conference took place in Indonesian soil gave Bandung a powerful local resonance. Bandung became more than a city where an event had ended. It became a symbolic space closely associated with internationalism, decolonization, and political communication. The 1955 conference gained international visibility, largely because of People's Republic of China presence, which so China joined this conference, and China was probably the most important country that took part in this conference. So China gave a big visibility to the Bandung conference. Indonesian Students' Organization followed the Bandung Conference very closely, and they discussed it, they debated it, and they interpreted its meaning. Among them, the Federation of Indonesian University Student Organization played a central role in developing the idea that students themselves could become part of this Afro-Asian movement. It's important to stress the idea that the idea of the National Student Conference didn't suddenly appear in 1956. Already in early 50s, the Indonesian students had imagined meetings among Asian and Arab students, especially because Arab countries had been among the first to support Indonesian independence in 1945. However, the ideas remained largely abstract and politically fragile. The Federation of Indonesian University Student Organization was part of a bigger organization called International Union of Students. This big organization was based in Eastern Europe, so it was really close to Soviet Union. And consequently, the Indonesian Student Organization was viewed with suspicion by the West and labeled as pro-communist. But Bandung 1955 changed the condition of possibility. After 1955, the idea of an Afro-Asian student conference was not urgent utopia. It became concrete, urgent, and politically causal. Bandung showed that it was possible to organize a large international meeting outside the West, to attract global media attention, and to develop a shared political language that would circulate across borders. For students, this was decisive. Bandung 1955 demonstrated them that international communication wasn't necessary only for states. It could be appropriated, translated, and reshaped by non-state actors, including students themselves. The Afro-Asian Students' Conference of 1956 emerged as a conscious imitation of Bandung, but not as a passive copy. Students deliberately modeled their conference on the 1955 event, while at the same time transforming its meaning. They translate the language of governments into the language of students, state diplomacy into cultural and educational cooperation, international politics into everyday academic experience. So this act of translation is crucial from the perspective of media and cultural studies. It shows that political communication is never simply reproduced. It is recontextualized, reframed, and resignified by different actors. In this sense, the student conference was born through communication. It was made possible not by formal authority or institutional power, but by shared narratives, symbolic references, and media visibility. This conference, organized by students, wasn't only organized in the shadow of Bandung. It was organized with a full awareness of being compared to Bandung. Students knew that the conference would be observed, interpreted, and judged in relation of the event of 1955. This awareness shaped every aspect of the conference: the choice of days, the language they use, the things they addressed, and the way communication itself was managed. The choice of location was highly symbolic. The students' conference took place in Bandung, in the same building that hosted the Afro-Asian Conference of 1955, so the year before. Bejendung Merdeka in Bandung, and the choice of this place was a deliberate communicative choice. It was a way to say, uh, we are here in the same place where our leaders discuss about important things, and we can also discuss about important things. Space, in this case, function as a medium. The building itself became a communicative resource, linking the student conference to the prestige and global visibility of Bandung 1955. The conference was also deeply self-aware. Participants knew that they were being watched not only by other students, but also by governments, journalists, and international observers. This awareness influenced how they spoke and how they chose to emphasize. The conference brought together delegations from around 27 countries across Asia and Africa. Many students had never met before. They came from different colonial backgrounds, spoke different languages, and had very different political experiences. Communication was therefore not spontaneous or natural. It required constant mediation. Most interventions were delivered in colonial languages, especially English and French. This choice was neither accidental or naive. Students were fully aware of the contradiction involved. The same languages that had once structured colonial domination were now being used to build post-colonial solidarity. Rather than rejecting these languages, students treat them as a strategic tools. They understood that speaking in English or French allowed the word to circulate beyond the conference room, to reach journalists, international organizations, and transnational audience. The language of the conference was the word hybrid. On the one hand, it borrowed heavily from the political vocabulary already established in Bandung 1955. Anti-colonialism, independence, peace, cooperation, and also solidarity. On the other hand, it introduced themes that spoke directly to student experiences: education, universities, access to knowledge, curricula, and cultural models. This hybrid language reveals something crucial. The students weren't only speaking to themselves, they were addressing multiple audiences simultaneously. Their peers in Asia and Africa, so to other students in Asia and Africa, national governments, the media, and international observers. The conference thus functioned as a multi-layered communicative space, where every statement had to be calibrated in relation to different listeners. Journalists were present, primarily from Indonesian national and local media. Their coverage tended to emphasize continuity with Bandung 1955, framing the student conference as a natural extension of the real diplomatic event. Alongside them, there were also student journalists who wrote for student magazines and youth organizations, contributing to a parallel and less institutionalized circulation of information. One particular repeating example of media framing came from an American observer in this picture, Bilal Hanna, who described the conference organized by students as the Little Bandung Conference. From a communicative perspective, this expression is extremely telling. On the one hand, it acknowledged the importance of this event and linked it to the symbolic capital of Bandung 1955. On the other hand, it positioned the student conference as something secondary and derivative from the Bandung Conference of 1955. With a single label, the event was made visible and at the same time diminished. This shows that media language doesn't seem to describe reality. It actively shapes historical memory. Inside the conference itself, there was also clear tension around communication. Some delegates, such as the Filipino representative Guillermo de Vega, argued that the conference should focus mainly on educational issues in order to avoid accusation of excessive politicization, while other students, like the Cameroonian delegate Fosso Fodon, insist that education couldn't be separate from politics in a world still shaped by colonial power relations. So I would like to ask you, what do you think about if this conference should be focused only on academic matters close to students or also about political questions? So, what do you think? is it a good idea to combine both elements in that situation, or students should focus on student issues? Anyone?
Anyone?
You can just express.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. About the question earlier, was that in the general Afro-Asian conference, in the general one, not the students one, or is it the student one? Oh, okay. So should it matter for students to also talk about politics? I think it should definitely matter to bring both elements, but because they are currently students and they are currently focusing on their degree, their own life, their own pathway. So I think for the students themselves is that they have both things to worry about. Well, maybe the general conference have finished their studies, have other things to focus on, while the students themselves, they also have to focus on their academic, while as focusing on trying to voice out what the students have to discuss on the conference itself. So I think it goes back to their own, like, for students itself, they have those things to worry about, which is what they're currently studying on, and also their future path life. I think that's my answer.
Someone else?
Thank you very much. So my thoughts on this, and I think it is absolutely an important thing that a student should care about politics, because as you know, everything is political at this point, especially if you're taking the studies in social studies, that we know the saying that the history is going by a future. So everything is narrated, everything is political, and I really think that the student should care and really should care about politics.
Someone else? How many of you agree with your colleagues? All of you agree with your colleagues?
Yeah.
So nobody thinks that students should focus only student issues. It is not a right answer, right? You can just express what you think. So you all agree with your colleagues, right? So you hold on. Many of the issues discussed are very close to students' everyday experience. Simple but really important questions emerge. Who teaches in our university? The students ask who should teach. Which text we should use? In which languages we should study? And which cultural model we should use in our university? Columbia University appeared as deeply ambiguous place. On the one hand, they were instruments for reproducing imperial domination. On the other hand, they were also places where students' elites were formed and where radical critiques of colonialism could emerge. The political dimension of the Afro-Asian Student Conference was embodied by the Algerian delegation, linked to the National Liberation Front, and this delegation in Bandung promoted Algeria's independence. And with Sukarno's support, established a base in Jakarta. In this base was active until 1962, when Algeria got the independence. Coming back to the linguistic tension, this tension wasn't only ideological, it was communicative. It concerned tone, vocabulary, and the wording of resolution. Students were fully aware that language could protect them, but also expose them. They knew that what they say could be amplified or interpreted or even used against them. In this sense, the Afro-Asian Student Conference of 1956 functioned as a laboratory for understanding the relationship between media, language, and power in post-colonial world. The student political action was not simply spontaneous or emotional. It was intellectually reflective and communicatively strategic. Despite its ambition and its transnational scope, however, the Afro-Asian Student Conference of 1956 had much more limited and fragile media afterlife. than the Bandung Conference of 1955. This difference is not accidental. It then has something important about how political memory is produced and about the role of media and power in deciding which events are remembered and which are forgotten. How many of you did know the student conference already? Nobody. Did you know this conference before? And we are in Indonesia. If you don't know this conference, imagine abroad. So this conference is being forgotten, and this is also why media didn't cover this event very well. Unlike one in 1955, the student conference wasn't led by head of states. It didn't produce documents destined to enter diplomatic archives or to be seen repeatedly in international relations literature. It was a student-led event, less institutionally protected, more exposed to political suspicion, and more easily dismissed as marginal. Over time, dominant narrative of decolonization and focused mainly on states, leaders, and intergovernmental conferences. Students, despite their crucial role in circulating these ideas between networks and experimenting with new political languages, have largely remained at the margins of the historical memory. From the media perspective, this marginalization is particularly significant. Events guided by governments tend to benefit from sustained institutional communication, archival preservation, and continuous media visibility over time. Students' initiatives, by contrast, usually rely on much more fragile communicative infrastructures. They depend on students' newspapers, informal networks, and temporary publications. When these channels disappear, much of the historical trace disappears with them. This is why this conference is not really famous. The Operation Student Conference of 1956 clearly illustrates this broader dynamic. Visibility doesn't automatically translate into lasting recognition. An event can be intensely communicated in the moment, yet fail to sediment into long-term memory if it lacks institutional support. At the same time, the conference reveals something else. For many governments, the problem wasn't simply what students were doing, but what they were saying and how effectively they were able to circulate their words. The student conference produced resolutions, personal contacts, and organizational proposals. But above all, it produced visibility. It showed that students could speak across national borders and articulate critics that didn't pass through state channels. This communicative capacity quickly became politically sensitive. In the context of the Cold War and the consolidation of post-colonial states, students occupied a particularly ambiguous position. They were young, educated, and mobile. They could travel, write, meet, and build transnational connections. From the perspective of state authorities, this combination was potentially destabilizing. In the initial phase, many governments didn't repress student communication directly. Instead, they tried to manage and channel it. Student organizations were supported, conferences were funded, and spaces for discussion were tolerated, as long as students' language remained aligned with official state narratives. But this tolerance was conditional. When students began to address internal inequalities, economic problems, and the limits of post-colonial governments themselves, the situation changed drastically. Student speech was no longer celebrated as part of the decolonization project. It became something to be monitored, arbitrarily, and eventually constrained. From this point on, the struggle was no longer all about political positions. It increasingly became a struggle over communication itself. Who was allowed to speak, in which spaces, and to which audience? This dynamic became particularly visible in Indonesia, but it wasn't limited to it. Across much of the post-colonial world, governments reacted to student mobilization by restricting access to media, disturbing autonomous student organization, and limiting space of public debate. What emerged here is a crucial insight. Repression doesn't operate only through physical force. It also operates through the regulation of language, media, and communicative spaces. The story of the Afro-Asian Student Conference of 1956 shows that communication can be a powerful political resource, but also a fragile one. The communicative space opened by Bandung and by the student conference were real, but temporary. They weren't fully institutionalized or protected. And when political conditions change, they close rapidly. This doesn't mean that the student failed, rather shows that political communication is always embedded in broader power structures. When those structures shift, the possibility for speech, visibility, and connection shift as well. Let me now tell you something about Indonesia and about the role of Indonesian students in the years following Bandung. In the period immediately after Bandung, Indonesian students enjoyed a strong political legitimacy. They were widely seen as a part of the national project and as the heirs of the anti-colonial struggle. Many of them had actively participated in mobilization against Dutch coup, and universities were initially perceived as space of political engagement, debate, and discussion. From the late 50s onward, however, the situation began to change. As the post-colonial state consolidated its power, student mobilization was increasingly seen not as a resource, but as a potential source of instability. What is crucial for our discussion today is how repression operates. It didn't take the form of immediate or generalized violence. Instead, it worked gradually through the control of communication. Student newspapers were censored or closed. Autonomous student organizations were dissolved or absorbed into official structure. Public assemblies on campuses were restricted. Step by step, universities cease to function as an open communicative space and become environments subject to surveillance. This pattern wasn't unique to Indonesia. Across much of the post-colonial world, governments reacted to student mobilization in similar ways. But in Indonesia, this process became increasingly systematic during the 60s and the 70s, culminating in the institutional regulation of campus life under the new quota. So by that point, political activity within university was no longer simply discouraged, it was structurally constrained. The communicative spaces that made transnational student conference possible in the 50s were effectively closed. Seen from this perspective, the decline of student conferences and transnational student networks wasn't the result of political apathy or failure. It was the outcome of a deliberate narrowing of communicative spaces. At this point, we can move to the present, not to make a simple comparison, but to reflect on a deeper continuity. If we look at youth mobilization and student protest in Asia, but not only in Asia, today, for example, in 2025, one thing becomes immediately clear. Communication is still at the heart of political action. What was really changed are the technologies, not the underlying logic. In many recent mobilizations, for example, last year in several Asian countries, social media are not simply tools that support protests. They are a space where political action actually begins. Very often, movements emerge first online through short videos, images, hashtags, memes, and informal language before appearing in the streets. These communicative practices allow narratives to circulate extremely quickly. A local protest can be seen, commented, and also interpreted across national borders within just a few hours. This creates a powerful effect that is structurally similar to what Bandung produced in the 50s. The feeling of not being isolated, of being part of one transnational moment. In this sense, social media today perform a function comparable to that of newspaper, radio, and conferences in the 50s. They create connection, share references, and image communities of political actors. What was changed is not only synchrony of communication itself, but its speed, its scale, and the degree of exposure interest. However, there is also a crucial difference. In 1956, during the student conference, the main challenge for students was how to become visible. Today, the challenge is often how to remain visible without becoming vulnerable. Digital communication amplifies voices, but it also records them. Every post leaves trace, every image can be archived, analyzed, and reused in context very far from the original intention. Visibility and exposure are no longer separable. This creates a constant tension between the desire to speak openly and the need for protection. Students and activists today often rely on anonymity, irony, code language, indirect references, or memes to reduce risk. These strategies may appear new, but they respond to a problem that is not new at all. Students in 1956 faced a similar dilemma. They were acutely aware that the words were being observed, interpreted, and potentially used against them. They carefully calibrated their language, balanced practical aspirations with strategic caution, and reflected on how their messages might circulate beyond the conference page itself. What has changed dramatically is the temporal dimension of communication. In 1956, ideas traveled through newspaper, letters, and conferences, often taking weeks or months to circulate. Today, they circulate in real time, but in both cases, communication remains the central terrain of political struggle. At the same time, contemporary communication also produces new distortions. Rapid circulation makes it harder to distinguish between verified information, interpretation, and deliberate manipulation. In several Asian contexts, youth protests in 1955 have been accompanied by waves of disinformation, decontextualization, decontextualized images, and also rumors that intensify polarization and suspicion. All of these remind us that communication is never neutral. It can create solidarity, but it can also fragment, polarize, or expose. Seen from this perspective, the history of the African Student Conference of 1956 is not distant or irrelevant. It offers a critical lens for thinking about the opportunities and limits of students' communication today. I would like to conclude by returning once more to the African Student Conference, not as a historical episode to be commemorated, but as a question for the present. The students who met in Bandung in 1956 believed that an intellectual conference could be a political act. They understood it as an intellectual moment, a space for slow collective reflection, translation across languages, debate, disagreement, and the production of shared meanings. Political action wasn't separate from thinking, it was grounded in it. The conference was low, it was collective, it was intellectually demanding. Today, student and political communication often follows a different path. Political engagement frequently begins online and moves rapidly toward visibility and stream action. Digital platforms privilege speed, immediacy, emotional resonance, and short formats. They are powerful tools for mobilization, but they also compress time, reduce space for deliberation, and fragment collective reflection. This doesn't mean that contemporary movements are less political, but it does suggest that the intellectual dimension of collective action has been profoundly transformed. So I would like to conclude with some questions to you. And the first one is, what might be lost and what might be gained when political communication becomes faster than collective thinking? Because the conference of 1956 was an example of collective thinking. Students met personally, they shared ideas, they reached some compromise, and so on. Now communication is really fast, so I would like to know from you too. What is that the pro and against this changing in communication? Anyone? What are the advantages of today's communication using social networks, using short videos, memes, and so on?
Okay. I think for me, one might be lost is probably the seriousness of the issue because I think for some people some issues can be turned into a meeting and if at some point it can lose some sort of seriousness of the issues itself. But I would say that the what might be gained is the level of awareness of the people because people could relate to it more, people could understand to it more easily and more accessible than before. That's what I lost to take.
Someone else? So imagine that the Afro-Asian Student Conference in 1956 takes place today. Where would this conference begin today? Online, physically, in a hybrid mode? What do you think about it? If you have to organize a student conference between students of different countries, where do you want to organize this conference?
Answering the question, I believe most conferences today have they would take place in a building where I guess it's where most people can access it, but they would also probably be streaming it on social media, on YouTube, Instagram, and maybe some people would join through Zoom or through video chat with someone in the conference. And I believe the conference would be bigger than it was back in the day, but it also would be. I feel like it wouldn't be taken seriously because sometimes there were a couple of conferences that I watched that with my friends that we were only watching the video and really paying attention to it.
Someone else? Just something me.
You want to share your ideas?
Someone? If you have to organize this conference, where would you like to do it? Online? Yeah. You can just say what you think.
I'm sorry, sir. Could you back to the previous slide before this?
So today you are supposed to organize an African students conference. You have to invite students from different countries in Asia and Africa. Would you like to organize it physically in a place and where? In university, in a symbolic building, or online, or doing both an hybrid conference?
Okay. So, based on what I was thinking, that where would this conference begin today? If the context of these slides that you have gave us, the information that you can give us, I would think that the conference would begin in a place where as big as I mentioned, or not mentioned, a palace that will fill out with a lot of students, a lot of smart people that talks about how the problem is to be solved, which would be get into the worldwide view, which can we use the social media. We could use the internet and we could use the camera behind it, or actually the media to live stream it. So the people around the world and the people inside the building could get the gist or the benefits of what to be talked about. So yeah, I think in a building where you could actually talk about the graph with a lot of people, with a smart school, smart people. Yeah, thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Sir.
How would we be the main audience? Would you like to refer to students only, to also governments, to international observers, and why? Anyone? If you organize this type of conference, would you like to refer to who? To students? To state leaders? Anyone?
So I would say my main audience, if I was the one who would come in this conference, is the students, of course, and the governments, because I want the government to be involved and understand the struggles of students around the world, the countries that I have invited. And also, maybe students from other countries are more than one, so I want them to share their struggles also, and all the governments are all ears about their struggles. Yeah, thanks.
Anyone else?
So beside then the students and also government, I would like also to invite the reporters and also the global observant, because it is also important that as global problems for the Afro-Asian continent, it is need to be reported and represented by the media for all over the world. So it is also important beside then the students and also for the media company.
Someone else? So we move to the next. How will it be communicated? If you have to invite students from other countries, if you have to refer to governments or to who you want, how do you communicate with a statement, with short videos, with memes, with hashtag? Which instrument would you like to use? Anyone? Do you think that official statements are still effective, or today if you want to share something to a big public, you have to use other alternatives?
Maybe as a Gen Z in Indonesia, we have this like phrase where we say like no viral can adjust to science. So it is important how the viral in social media is affected, how the concerns are represented in the social media for the younger generations. So for the first step, it would be nice for us to have like a collective understanding on the actual topics for discussions, and it will really effective for us Indonesians, especially to have this like tags or tagar for the movements in social media first as the first step.
Someone else? So, what will be easier or harder than 1956? If you have to organize this type of conference today, what is easier respect 1956. For example, I'll give you an example about visibility, or what it would be harder respect 1956. What do you think? Nowadays, what is easier?
It is quite hard to conclude, but I would say that it is harder than 1956 because the students have got today has significantly different than the 1956 one, because during that year, the 1956 is like several years after their after their independence, and they have already they still have the spirit of nationality. They still have the spirit of anti-colonialism and all that. But I do think that because of the globalization, because of the rise of the Western media towards the younger generation and nowadays, I think that it would be harder to create some sort of spirit or some sort of anti-colonial movement. Or I think it would be larger as a scale, but I think to create the same moment, the same momentum, and the same kind of spirit, I think it would be harder.
But it's not only about anti-colonial, also about solidarity, about Afro-Asian states, more cooperation. So, about all also these things. Anyone else? From the back? What do you think? Who want to say something? No. What do you think? No. So we move to the last one. What strategy do you think students will use today to protect themselves while speaking publicly? If you have to do publicly, are you afraid about something, or you feel free to speak? Do you want to cover your identity or not?
Second and now.
Anyone?
It's true. You have a
Well, I think the strategies that the students will use today to protect themselves while speaking publicly is, first, I think most of teenagers or students will speak to social media, so they will speak about what happened to the Muslim. So they don't want to express themselves too much, so because the government today is not really supportive towards the students of like the expressive students. So yeah, I think that's all.
Thank you. Anyone else? Nobody? Okay, so I think that we're done. If you have question, you can just ask. I would like to conclude to say that tools have changed, the speed has changed, but the underlying logic has not. The students of 1956 and students today face the same fundamental problem. How to use communication to open political space, knowing that this space is always fragile. Before I stop, I would like to address you directly. You are students. You two, like those we talk today, are in a phase in which your main task is not to have definitive answers, but also to ask questions. My invitation is very simple: to be curious in your studies, but also in your life. Ask questions, even when it's not clear what the answer might be, or when the answer doesn't come right away. there is nothing wrong with not knowing something goes wrong when we stop asking. Studying also means this, not settling for the first explanation, but comparing different points of view, maintaining a critical eye toward what we read and hear. If Bangun can tell something to us today, I think that it's the question matter even when they remain open. So thank you for the attention. If you have questions about anything, you can just ask or so can be animated when you want. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Okay. Okay. Before we wrap up for today, we'll have a picture together. A picture for documentary purposes. Okay. Could you please move forward?